Dispossessed Majority. White America is lost forever unless we find a way to save us. We are at a crossroads. Perhaps a starting point is listen to some of the smartest men of our age, some of the smartest in the history of our nation, the history of Western man. In my search for what was wrong in America, the first and one of the most relevant book, out of the estimated 1,000 I have read in the past 35 years, is The Dispossessed Majority. This book, written 50 years ago, discusses the situation of white America, the children of the founders face in its struggle to keep America from self-destruction, the path it is on today, 2024. I corresponded with Mr. Robertson, writer of this book, for 2 years before his death. Interesting, intelligent, and dedicated American patriot he was. Below is a short summation of this seminal book. You would do well to read the entire version. Mr. Robertson, as you will hear, was a prophet equal to the prophets of old in the Bible. But on a different subject, with his words, we can have a better chance of designing our future here in America and Europe. I hope we can find our way out of this mess we are in. Wilmot Robertson wrote The Dispossessed Majority, but could not find a publisher that would publish it. So he self-published, and it became a NYT bestseller from word of mouth alone. It is a seminal work, published in 1975, a prophetic work that has much value for us today. Quotations from Wilmot Robertson's The Dispossessed Majority are as follows. From the standpoint of the American majority, the political dogma which served it so well during most of American history has now become one of the chief agents of its decline. From the standpoint of the minorities, it has become a powerful tool for their advancement. Almost every political act is now measured against the yardstick of minority interest. Almost every political event of the past and present is assigned to some way station along the march of democracy. The current political struggle is falsely presented as a contest between liberalism and conservatism, exploited and exploiters, tolerance and intolerance, equality and inequality, freedom and oppression, since it conceals the real nature of what is happening and the real intentions of the dogmatizers. Dogmatic interpretation has become as powerful a force as dogma itself. A principal cause of the powerful and pervasive anti-democratic element in modern American democracy is that elections come every 2, 4, or 6 years, while the media and pressure groups grind out their propaganda every day. Every politician is extremely sensitive to the block vote. Farm, religious, minority, professions, regional economic labor, races, etc. The economic blocks which form within the framework of representative government are storm signals of the second stage of democratic growth, the progression from the political to the economic democracy. The equalitarian premise of economic democracy is that without an equitable distribution of wealth, there can be no democracy at all. Marxism is the midwife of economic democracy. Lately, the third and final stage of democracy, the social phase, has begun to materialize. Like political and economic democracy, social democracy is not new, but it seems to come last in the cycle of democratic growth or decay. Because it capitalizes on the deeper, by instinctive undercurrents of human behavior, its historical manifestations are not always easy to recognize and do not often penetrate conventional history books. Its theoretical genesis, however, is not difficult to trace. Being a composite of the religious concept of the brotherhood of man, Lockean and Jeffersonian assertions about human rights, Marxist class agitation, and the pronouncements of modern anthropologists and sociologists concerning human sameness. Once political and economic democracy takes hold in a society, the pressure for social democracy is certain to mount. This is especially true in a multiracial state. Inevitably, the unwashed, the disadvantaged, and the envious will begin to ask, or will be asked to ask by ambitious politicians, why, if man is politically equal and getting to be economically equal, should he not be socially equal? In the context of contemporary democratic politics, such a question has but one answer. Social democracy is the thorniest stage of democracy in a multiracial state, because more than any other phase, it increases the area of contact, the social interface, of the various demographic elements, and the study of racial relations has shown that the greater the social interface, the greater the racial friction. Political democracy orders members of different populations groups to vote together, legislate together, and rule together. Economic democracy makes it necessary for them to work together. Social democracy, however, exponentially enlarges the area of contact by forcing the most diverse elements of the population to live together. At present, this social mixing is restricted to neighborhoods, schools, playgrounds, and clubs. But there are for cues at work to carry it into the last redoubt of individualism and privacy, the home. The inner contradictions of the three phases of both ancient and modern democracy become apparent when it is remembered that political democracy begins as a means of protecting property, while economic democracy seeks to divide it up, and social democracy encourages its theft. In the ironic chain of events that govern the democratic cycle, the same rights which were secured and recognized, often with great difficulty, in the political phase of democracy are de-emphasized and frequently revoked in the economic and social phases. It is hard to believe that the right to privacy, the right to choose friends, neighbors, and schoolmates, the right to join fraternal or social organizations, the right to air one's opinion in public, and the right of access to one's own culture are not as fundamental to human liberty, to the unfoldment of the human spirit, as any other. Yet these are precisely the rights held in low esteem by the most ardent advocates of social democracy. The old liberalism of Locke and Jefferson was an entirely different breed of ideology from the new liberalism of today. The old liberalism stressed individual, not collective enterprise, less government, not more, states' rights, not federal control, laissez-faire, not welfare, liberty, not security, evolution, not revolution. Moreover, none of the great liberals of the past, in spite of their ringing appeals to equality, was willing to admit the equality of the races. Public figures whose private lives have been a shambles and who have proved utterly incapable of raising their own children presume to write copious newspaper columns and magazine articles on family life, marital problems, and child upbringing. The mother with a delinquent daughter, instead of improving conditions in her own home, becomes a social worker and attempts to help other families with delinquent daughters. In the liberal scheme of things, there is a widening gulf between the person and the act, the thought and the deed. The politician who fights for school integration sends his own children to private schools. The criminal is not really guilty. He has merely committed an unfortunate act caused by an unfavorable environment. Someone else or something else is guilty. The liberal loves everyone of every race, but he flees to the suburbs where he prefers to live among whites, even conservative whites. It is so secret that liberals are fonder of mankind than men. The tragic view of life, the struggle of one man, not mass man, against the irreversibility of fate does not fit easily into liberal thought. Nor does patriotism. Modern liberalism, of course, does not admit to being racist. In fact, it pretends to be anti-racist. But every word it speaks, every policy it supports, every program it publicizes, every cause it underwrites, every piece of legislation it introduces is racist to the core. Modern liberalism, in spite of its bewitching ecumenical cliches, is also dedicated to one segment of the American population, this time the unassimilable minorities. Its original purpose subverted, its original ideals redirected and reinterpreted, the liberalism of today has become a minority religion. Within, the attack on private ownership grows fiercer, not because, as official socialist doctrine has it, state control of the means of production would bring about greater economic benefits, but because private property is one of the biggest stumbling blocks to the latter-day perversions of democracy and liberalism. The liberal minority coalition does not covet property to spread it more equitably. The affluent minorities and most majority liberals already have enough possessions, and the poor minorities are more envious than greedy. The aim is not so much confiscation as revenge. The declining fortunes of those on the way down provide a kind of ghoulish satisfaction to those on the way up. With the passing of the melting pot fantasy has come the anti-fantasy, the American mosaic. The intellectual mise-en scene has suddenly been rearranged to accommodate a new sociological fad, the pluralistic society, in which all races and nationality groups live harmoniously side by side, all maintaining and strengthening their racial and cultural identity, each making its own contribution in its own way to the total picture of American life. Like the promoters of the melting pot, the salesmen of the pluralism have misread history, which teaches that pluralistic societies are static and caste-ridden, and a standing invitation to disorder and disaster. Historically disoriented, the voices of pluralism are also dramatically contradictory. They are opposed to racism in theory, but support minority racism in practice. They uphold group identity, but demand integration. They approve of racial quotas, but are against racial discrimination. Meanwhile, the American social order totters along in the grip of rising racial tension, which is both a cause and effect of pluralism. The mosaic has turned out to be as great a failure, as great a misfiring of the imagination, as the melting pot. Mosaics are bits and pieces of inorganic matter which once put in place stay in place. Races are pulsating, organic continuities altering in size and status, now dynamic, now static. As the age dictates and as they dictate to the age. The darkening immigrants is not evidence that America is entering an age of pluralism. He is a harbinger of changing racial hierarchies. In spite of all their divergences, unassimilable minorities, many Southern Italians, miscellaneous Mediterranean and Balkan, Jews, most Mexicans, many Asians, many American Indians, most Puerto Ricans, and most Negroes, have joined in an alliance which, with the assistance of majority splitter of the ranks, has steered the march of American events for the greater part of the century. In addition to combining their votes for carefully selected political candidates, the more dynamic of these minorities have overcome their polar differences to forge the solid ideological front which is destroying the most sacrosanct American institutions. What, then, is the unifying force strong enough to prevail against all this diversity, the centripetal force mighty enough to turn off the racial centrifuge in which these minorities should logically be imprisoned? To paraphrase Nietzsche, it probably has to do with the will to power and the will to powerlessness. The desire for power by those unassimilable minorities who have little, the desire for more power by those who have much, and the desire to give away power by those who have much, and the desire to give away power by deracinated majority members. Feeding these desires are such old psychological imponderables and intangibles as envy, insecurity, fear, hate, and even, perhaps, white self-hate. These desires have also received some economic nourishment, but not as much as might be supposed. In recent years, in the ghettos of the big cities, one minority has been looting, robbing, and burning the assets of another, yet the latter continues to put significant amount of its brainpower and money at the disposal of the former. The only safe assumption to make about the force that unifies and galvanizes the unassimilable minorities is that it is most apparent and most forceful when directed against the white majority. Accordingly, it may be said that the chief source of minority unity and coordination is that great, sick, floundering, demographic white whale which can be attacked, smashed, bitten, and nipped at with impunity. Above all else, it is opposition to the majority which has built the effective but uneasy alliance between the unassimilable minorities and the majority splinters. The Social Democrats attacked the white majority in a way that pleased the majority's opponents most: race. The basic plan was to raise minority racism to the boiling point, while submitting majority race consciousness to the numbing ideology of liberalism. The second plan was to develop a technique whereby the will for the many could be defeated and voted down by the few. This was to be accomplished in two ways: controlling the vote by managed news, educational indoctrination, and the nomination of carefully screened candidates, going around the vote when necessary by Supreme Court edicts and secret foreign policy commitments. Meanwhile, whenever social democracy went too far, too fast, and a spark of resistance flared, it could be taken care of by shouting down the speakers, breaking up their meetings, occupying plants, government offices, and centers of learning, or, if worst came to worst, detonating a few well-placed sticks of dynamite. Certainly, if the political phase is ever to be revived through the Herculean efforts of a united majority party, it must be clearly remembered, as it was once so clearly understood, that democracy makes the highest demands of its participants and offers a measure of freedom only to those who can handle freedom. It is the rule of a people, not several peoples. The loftiest and most quixotic of all political ideals, it is even, perhaps, the expression of a racial trait. If so, modern political scientists have been the biggest prospectors of fool's gold in the history of human thought. Why have there been no successful proletarian revolutions, and very few attempts at any kind of revolution in Northern Europeans or nations with predominantly Northern European populations? Is it unreasonable to assume that the genetic composition of the Northern European peoples has something to do with this record? Why is Japan, in spite of a defeat in WTIS that involved atomic devastation, the most stable great power in Asia and the least susceptible to revolution? Is not part of the answer that Japan is the most racially homogeneous of the large Asian nations? Why is Costa Rica the most prosperous and progressive country in Central America? The fact that it is the one Central American state with a dominant and homogeneous white population may provide a clue. Why did Germany almost succumb to revolution after defeat in WWI, yet become the most affluent and most stable nation in Europe after its much worse defeat in WWI? Could it be because the dynamic minority, which was present in large numbers after WWI, could hardly be said to exist after WWI? The Jews. Although Israel may be the spiritual home of Jewry, the United States remains the Jewish center of gravity. Just as no one can fully understand present-day world affairs without taking Jews into account, so no member of the American majority can even begin to comprehend the pattern of current American events without a rudimentary knowledge of the aims, the habits, and the political, economic, and social status of the American Jews. In many respects, the goals and attitudes of American Jewry are major clues to recent American history. Up to the present, the story of American anti-Semitism has been unimportant, unimpressive, and inflated. However, the removal of all things Jewish from the arena of rational discussion automatically relegates unfriendly opinions of Jews to the hush-shed, whispers of office, living room and country club, to underground hate sheets, and to the verbal moosing of crackpots, haunted by visions of bearded elders plotting world conquest. All this lends an aura of mysticism and romantic obscurantism to anti-Semitism, which it does not deserve, and which endows it with a kind of kinetic and subterranean diabolism. The day anti-Semitism breaks out into the light again, as suppressed ideologies have the habit of doing, it cannot avoid becoming the stock in trade of the apocalyptic avenger who knows that emotion and dogma move more mountains than reason. The sudden release of tensions and hatreds pent up during decades of censorship and indoctrination will probably obviate any less explosive outcome. Instead of submitting anti-Semitism to the free play of ideas, instead of making it a topic for debate in which all can join, Jews and their liberal supporters have managed to organize an inquisition in which all acts, writings, and even thoughts critical of Jewry are treated as a threat to the moral order of mankind. The Jewish intellectual who believes passionately in the rights of free speech and peaceful assembly for all, but rejoices when permits are refused for anti-Semitic meetings, and rocks crack against the skulls of anti-Semitic speakers. Admitting the almost incredible disparity between Jewish numbers and Jewish influence in the United States is dangerous, but it is growing more difficult for anyone not to admit it. In the long run, the Jewish place in American life cannot rest on the sanctity of institutions, dated dogmas, or the divine right of minorities. It must rest on the cause and effect relationship between the rise of the Jewish establishment and the majorit's disestablishment. If Jews are chiefly responsible for the present grinding assault on the nation's racial backbone, then the Jewish minority must come under public scrutiny. America could survive forever without Jews. It could not last a day without the majority, the African within America. The Negro minority confronts the United States with a problem which seems beyond solution. Fanned and overheated by both black and white agitators of often different reasons, Negro racism has now reached the point where it has literally grounded the once soaring American zeitgeist and is threatening to mutilate it beyond recognition. There is also a multiplying within the Negro community a large criminal caste and an even larger caste of welfare recipients and dehumanized drug addicts. If majority members would only comprehend that the whole point, the whole drive, the very essence of minority racism is not to obtain equality but superiority, most of the misunderstanding and misinterpretations of contemporary Negro behavior would be avoided. Racism simply cannot be bought off. In its dynamic stages, it can only be controlled or suppressed by superior force, a force most effectively provided by an opposing or countervailing racism. What is indisputable is that the one way not to stop Negro militancy is to reward it. There is no better indication of the decline of the American majority than the recent and continuing successes of the Black Power movement. Negroes belong to the most backward of the world's major races and to the most backward of America's large population groups. Nevertheless, in the past several years, they have managed to erect a kind of state within a state, and in so doing have removed themselves well outside the range of the democratic process. In the name of equality, they have achieved a kind of super-equality, which has led to the establishment of a double standard, one for themselves, one for whites, in the judicial, educational, and welfare sectors of American society. That all this has been accomplished so quickly is vivid confirmation of the power of racism. Negroes, as a few of their leaders will admit in private, have little else working for them. The more Negroes are helped, the more they seem to need help, and the louder they demand it. The more they progress, the more America as a nation seems to retrogress. If those who advance the genetic argument are right, then all the short-term gains Negroes have made in the last several decades will add up to a long-term disaster. But because there is so much more at stake than the fate of American Negroes, the liberal minority coalition, abetted by a sizable contingent of so-called conservatives, presses forward with integration at all costs. As always, those who have the courage to air opposing views are either ignored or subjected to instant character assassination. But while liberalism still rules the country's thinking, it has little control over the organic processes of society. As a tribesman, the Negro was a member of the tribal family. As a slave, he had his master's family. As a sharecropper, he had his own family. As an industrial peon or hardcore unemployed, he is beginning to have no family at all, since the present welfare system provides extra financial assistance for fatherless households and for each illegitimate child. The upshot is that the urban Negro has now reached an impasse. Having lost his hearth, his roots, his religion, and his way, he is rapidly losing whatever social commitments he has left. The worst having been done, the more dynamic elements of the Negro minority are demanding redress, somewhat as undisciplined children who have lost their innocence might seek redress from parents who abandoned them. To these demands, whites have a choice of 4 responses: oppression, which is immoral; integration without intermarriage, which is impossible; integration with intermarriage, which is inconceivable; separation, which is impractical. Of all these untenable courses of action, the last, which would establish independent or semi-independent Negro communities tangential to white communities, is perhaps the most nearly tenable. Whichever is ultimately chosen, the American Negro will soon be out of his private wilderness. He will either return to his old world homeland or be assigned a homeland in the new, or there will be no homeland for anyone, black or white, in urban America. The law and crime. Concerning adulteration of the law, Robertson states, as social systems grew more complex, laws were codified and began to spin their web throughout the length and breadth of human activity. In more sophisticated societies, laws became the rules of the game of civilization. As respect for the law diminished, laws proliferated, or rather degenerated, into masses of contradictory regulations. Tacitus described the cause and effect relationship in one of his neater epigrams. The more corrupt the government, the greater the numbers of laws. Nevertheless, an established body of law has a conservative influence on society. The older laws are, the more inertia they acquire and the more difficult they are to change, particularly when they have the combined support of custom, religion, and practicality. It is a truism that these triple foundations of an effective legal system are far more common in homogeneous than in heterogeneous societies. A diversity of people means a diversity of customs, which create basic contradictions in the fabric of the law from the very beginning. As Matthew Arnold once noted, the mixture of persons of different race in the same commonwealth, unless one race had a complete ascendancy, tended to confuse all the relations of human life and all men's notions of right and wrong. Over the past 25 years, the Supreme Court has had a drastic effect on all American lives. Robertson states, it was foreseeable that the main wave of the legal attack against the majority would be launched from the judicial branch of government. Overriding the will of the greatest number of Americans is more easily accomplished by 9 men appointed to office and responsible to no one, not even to each other, than by legislators who are subject to periodic electoral review. The rulings of the liberal and minority justices of the Supreme Court offered anti-majority factions a quasi-legal means of achieving societal goals that could never be obtained through the normal legislation process. Mr. Robertson has some very interesting statements on crime in a multiracial society. It is worth repeating that every race and every society have their criminals, but multiracial societies have more crime. And the multiracial society in which the struggle for power becomes an openly racial struggle has the most crime. Furthermore, there are some offenses, particularly certain kinds of sex offenses, which could only occur in heterogeneous societies. Racial crime is becoming the most common type of crime in America, yet American law refuses to distinguish it from any other kind of crime. Everyone is still equal before the law and entitled to the same legal safeguards. Although the racially motivated criminal no more deserves the protection and benefits of due process than an enemy soldier captured in battle. Both the enemy soldier and, increasingly, the minority lawbreaker feel their crimes are not crimes in the real sense, but simply acts of justifiable violence against an oppressor. This is why the odds against the racial criminal's rehabilitation in prison are so high. To most minority prisoners, the modern American prison is little more than a prisoner of war camp, albeit a strange and incomprehensible one from which prisoners are released while the war is still in progress and where the troops of both sides are incarcerated together as they continue, at close quarters, the racial conflict being waged outside. In a somewhat related matter, Mr. Robertson speaks racial conflict in the Vietnam War. He states many Negro soldiers in Vietnam had special war aims of their own. Almost half of those questioned said they would use arms to gain their rights when they returned to the States. There were several military skirmishes between white and black troops during the course of the war, and 305 attacks on whites with fragmentation grenades, resulting in 101 deaths. Crime in America will almost certainly go on increasing until criminologists and social scientists are willing to consider the genetic ramifications of the problem. Because of the genetic link, Crime prevention should start in the home, or more properly, in the bedroom. There are already too many Americans, and many too many criminal Americans. For those criminal elements who not only insist on multiplying, but multiplying much faster than non-criminal elements, the only alternative is sterilization. Professor Samuel J. Holmes has stated that the sterilization of 10% of the American population would get rid of most hereditary defectives. The future. Mr. Robertson does not have any magic wands to correct the condition of the dispossessed majority. In fact, he expresses grave doubt for the survival of America as it now exists. By reading and understanding his thoughts, it is easy to reach the same conclusion. He states, "The majority must look for deliverance and regeneration within the defenses of the mind. There will be no end to its dispossession until the majority learns to reject all, repeat all, the main currents of modern liberal thought. And there can be no such rejection until the non-liberal and anti-liberal forces, which engender and direct modern liberalism, are clearly understood. To understand what has happened to the majority, it is first necessary to realize that the deterioration of power is as much the result of success as it is failure. The hard-pressed society knows better than to let down its guard. It cannot afford to ignore the motives and acts of its opponents. Conversely, the successful or affluent society, by virtue of its surplus of life's necessities, has the time to turn away from the grindstone of daily existence. Less touched by the existential forces of the human condition, its members have the rare and dangerous opportunity of stretching their individualism well beyond the normal societal breaking point. The successful could afford to share their success, and the majority did so with indiscriminate prodigality. The new immigrants began to vote, not as individuals, but as members of blocs. Many of them prospered greatly in an unrestricted economy, but they spent much of their wealth on group projects that were outside and often opposed to the national interest. They reveled in the freedom they could never win themselves, but instead of treating it respectfully and responsibly, they took advantage of it. Their children thronged to the free public schools of a matchless education system, where they learned enough about American civilization to criticize it, but not enough to become a part of it. It was predictable that the ruling white race, having been leveled to equality, would be further demoted to subject status. It was understandable that the subject races, having been raised to equality, might wish to climb higher, particularly after learned professors flattered their genes and whetted their ambitions with allusions to racial superiority. It was logical that blacks, having been told they were equal or superior to whites, would blame their social disadvantages not on any innate limitations, but on a devilish white conspiracy. To smash stirrings of resistance, the liberal minority general staff opened up all the old stops, the mind-deadening cacophony of Marxist and liberal dogma, the sly equalitarian appeals to minority racism, as well as a few new stops: drugs, pornography, homosexuality, the generation gap, and women's liberation. As usual, the big guns blasted the weakest spots in the majority's defenses, the children and the young women. But they zeroed in on the prime target, the majority's last redoubt, the family, the dignity of the individual, the triumph of reason, the rights of man. The majority's ancestors had been the first to develop these concepts and apply them to society. In their perverted modern form, they were the killers of society. Race was still the unspeakable historical determinant, although the loudest denouncers and deniers of race were, as always, the biggest racists. To the racial historian, race is the being and the becoming of organized humanity. As race has been the controlling factor of much of the human past, so it will assume even greater importance in the future. Supreme efforts can only be undertaken by large groups of men with similar political and social reflexes, by great teams, not great mobs, specifically by great races. Race, the highest manifestation of the team spirit, may be nature's way of organizing men for the accomplishing of the unaccomplishable. Just as the body rejects transplanted organs, Races have the habit of rejecting transplanted ideologies. They may accept them temporarily, but the buildup of antibodies is unceasing. At this particular point in time, the race best suited to shoulder the main weight of the evolutionary burden would appear to be the Northern European. The Northern European has managed to soar higher above the animal kingdom than the other divisions of mankind. At the moment, 2 devastating interracial wars within a quarter century and the dispossession of the American majority, the largest reservoir of Northern European genes, have grounded him. Permanently or temporarily, it is too early to know. To put the Northern Europeans back on the evolutionary track to rekindle the Northern European efflorescence is a project of monumental complexity. Should this pooling of the work and thought of a highly gifted but widely dispersed people ever be effected, there would be such a preponderance of power that no external predator would dare so much as touch the remotest corner of the Northern European living space, either in Europe, North America, or Australasia. The minorities within this living space, no longer able to prosper from the divisions of their hosts, might finally learn to look to themselves for sustenance. Such is the shimmering prospect of a Pax Americana, a world more encompassing than the Pax Romana, and more enduring and more constructive than the Pax Britannica. There would be emphatically no place for the old-style exploitation of non-whites, or the forcible adaptation of autochthonous civilizations to Northern European cultural norms. But everything hangs on the fate of the American white majority. If its dispossession is not stopped and reversed, there will be no Pax Americana, no halt to the decline of the West. In fact, there will soon be no America. History is insistent in pointing out that when the dominant population group goes, the country goes. As is daily becoming more apparent, the dying fall of the American majority is the dying fall of America itself.